Hi, this is the follow-up tutorial on our nature drawing. As you can see, I have my drawing up on the easel. You will probably be working flat with this, particularly if you decide you want to work with watercolor or any other type of paint. I've started utilizing a variety of items that I have around the house. Some are watercolors. Sometimes I went back in with my Lyra graphite stick, excuse me. Okay. In some areas I've used marker. Believe it or not, I even used coffee. So if you're one who doesn't happen to have any paint at home, that's perfectly okay. You can feel free to work in pencil. That's just fine. There's an area right in here where I've worked solely with pencil. I also utilized pencil in this area as well. I had a little bit of fun and went back in and used some watercolor as well. So whatever you happen to have around your house is just fine to use. So again, some of the things that you might choose once your initial drawing is dry, you might use some markers. These are just some Sharpie markers that I had hanging around. You could utilize a gel pen, okay? You could go with a trusty old pencil, could be number 2, or if you have a set of drawing pencils, you could utilize those as you like. You could also use color pencils. Crayons would work, oil pastels if you happen to have them, or even some of your dry pastels. And I happen to have my favorite pastel, and these are like thin stick dry pastels that I enjoy drawing with. And just to demonstrate a little bit some of the other things that you might find around the house in case you don't have watercolors, I utilized some fun things. I didn't have any food coloring. You might have food coloring and you're more than welcome to use that. That works beautifully. But you could also take, see these little like cupcake decorations and cake decorations. You could take a small amount of hot water, very small amount, add your whatever it is that you have, your little candies. Oh, hey, Luna. Add your little candies and dissolve it. And I've dissolved this in a glass jar so you can see that clearly, and Luna can see it as well. All right. And that can be utilized as paint. Also, hey, Luna, or snacks. Don't let your dog eat that. Go on, sweetheart. Thank you. Also, you might have a coffee drinker at your house. And if you have some leftover coffee, you can surely utilize that. These do not need to be stored in glass jars, okay? But I happen to use them so you can see clearly through the video. You most certainly want to let that coffee cool off before you utilize it, as it's going to be hot. And I don't want you to burn yourself, okay? So let's start with coffee. Let me open up my jar. Now, my coffee apparently is weak, so it wasn't terribly dark. So I just added some of the grinds to it to help it darken up a little bit. Hello, coffee drinker. No. Yeah. Ooh, baby. Okay. All right. She's all good. All right. So here's some of my coffee. And it's going to get some of the grinds in it, but when it dries, you can just dust that off. No big deal. And this basically will stain. And as I said, apparently I drink weak coffee. So I just paint this on. Now remember, when painting, you're going to want to paint on a flat, with your painting flat. Okay, you can see through here, this area. This is actually coffee that I painted on previously. And that dried nicely. It darkened up a little bit as it dried. Okay. If it's not dark enough, when it dries, you can go back over with a second layer. Just as with pencils, the same effect works. Additional layers will help to darken anything that you're working with. Okay. I also happen to have a cup of water handy, little yogurt cup, and a napkin. Now, if you have paper towel, napkin, or even an old rag, that you can use to dry your brushes between, between colors or when you're finished. Okay. Now, if you happen to have acrylics, of course, you want to never let the acrylic paint dry in your brush. It will damage your brush. You won't be able to utilize it after that. So let's play a little bit with some pastel. Over here, I worked with a little bit of watercolor on this particular leaf. So now I'm going to go ahead, I want to hit it with a little highlight of yellow so I can use a dry material such as this pastel, and it can give a much higher value of yellow and goes over quite nicely over top of the dry watercolor. Okay. If you want to kind of just feather that out, you certainly can, but can you see that just brightened up that leaf just a little bit? Okay. I can also utilize a white pastel. When using pastels, you want to clean off the edge that you're about to draw with so you won't get any residual color from a different pastel. And here I can bring in some highlights. If I lost them or I just painted over them, for instance. The highlights are wonderful when you want to sort of separate one petal from another. You don't want to go overboard. You just want to kind of give a hint of a highlight, and it will make it pop. Okay, and so just to bring that a little bit closer, please excuse my thumbs if they get in the way. You see how I just introduced a little bit of highlight to that flower up there. Okay. All right, so we talked about pastel, we talked about coffee. Let's look at other weird materials. This is my cake decorating Valentine's Day hearts that have been dissolved in water. And I'm going to go ahead and paint and can you make out some of that pink working over top of this particular flower here? Okay, we add a little bit of that through here. So we certainly can make it work. All right. Markers. Ooh, markers. Now, depending on the type of marker that you have, if you have a washable marker, right, like Crayola makes a washable marker. Some of the markers are actually water soluble, so you could, fill an area in with that given color and then take a brush with a slight amount of water in it, okay? If you have too much water in it, don't forget, it's always helpful to have paper towel or rag handy, and you can simply dab some of that water off, removing some of the excess, and it will allow you more control. So if you had a marker, you could then come back with a slightly damp brush, and you could work right over top of the marker, and it would give it more of a watercolor-like effect. Okay, not all markers are water soluble, of course, but I think you could use rubbing alcohol with other types of marker and utilize it in the same way. So you would fill in your area with the marker, take your brush and dip that into the rubbing alcohol, and you should be able to pull it up and paint with it in a certain manner. Now, I don't necessarily guarantee it'll be exactly like watercolor paint, or it will have its own effect and its own characteristic. We were moving into markers, so let me go ahead and I'm going to explore a little bit of hatching and cross hatching. You could even include some stippling. So I think I'm going to work in this leaf right here, and I'm going to think about directional lines. These are diagonal lines that I'm coming in with here. And because this leaf is behind this flower, I want to create the illusion of a shadow. I want to darken the value to kind of push it further back in space. So I've used the light teal. And now I'm going to come back with a darker blue, and I'm going to continue with a diagonal, but at a different angle. So I will come back this way. Okay, can you start to see that develop? Hopefully it came through on the video, but I'm beginning to darken it by adding additional layers of lines, okay? Cross-hatching, crisscrossing, okay? And the closer I keep the lines, the darker the value appears. So if you want it to be a lighter value when hatching or cross-hatching, a lighter value, you would keep the lines spaced further apart. If you want it to become darker and more condensed, you bring them tight against each other, and that will increase the value, making it much darker. Okay, and I can continue with this up through here. Of course, when hatching or cross-hatching, you can vary the length of the line, and that also affects the characteristic and the value as well. All right. Thinking about line quality can be an absolute benefit at this time. You remember line quality we studied previously. We looked at line quality when we were working in packet 1 of our Learning in Place materials. And you can feel free to review that. You'll also find that information on Google Classroom. You'll see some examples. Our first assignment from our second packet, you were asked to do some hatching and cross-hatching drawings, and you'll find examples in that assignment as well if you need to review. Now, as I come out here, I think I'm going to widen, because I want to lighten up the value. And so I might even begin stippling. Call this stippling. Some people just simply think of them as dots, which they are, but the technique is actually called stippling. Now, to that, I might add a varying color, a contrasting color. How about a little yellow? And I'm going to use my pastel for this. And once you get going with this, you'll start to notice that it creates a tremendous amount of texture and becomes rather interesting. I'm going to take a little bit of green and I'm going to stipple over top of some of my cross-hatched areas. I want to have a nice little transition from the blue to the yellow, so I'm also going to work a little bit over top of the yellow stippling. Nice way to create blending without actually having to smooth the materials. So you're visually blending it rather than physically smoothing and blending, okay? Your eyes will do the work for you. Okay, I think I'll leave that as is. I think we have a nice little example of that. And now I'm going to pull out the watercolor. Now, if you're not familiar with watercolor, here's what you'll need to have. A cup of clean water. And as you're working, you'll find that that water will get a little bit muddy, a little murky, might start to look a little bit like coffee, okay? When it starts to get dirty, you simply want to dump the water, rinse the container, and get yourself some fresh water. A lot of watercolorists find it's helpful to have multiple cups of water but it's not necessary. It just makes it a little easier to continue working. So you want to have a cup of water, either a paper towel, a napkin, or an old rag will do. Now remember, the paper towel and napkin, the point of that is to remove excess water. You also want to have it handy because when you change colors, if you're not going to use a different brush, you need to thoroughly wash the brush, okay? When washing a brush, you want to dip it into the water, swirl it on the bottom of your cup, okay? Use the side edge of the cup, like so. See how I'm just kind of pulling it backwards against the edge of the cup? I'm removing excess water. And then if you still have too much water, you're just simply going to place it on the napkin, give it a quick little roll, pull it backwards or towards yourself, and that will help remove excess water. And it would also help shape the brush, bringing it to a finer point, okay? We don't want to paint necessarily with our brush all splayed out, right? So if you want to get it to a finer point, dip it in that water, pull it backwards on the edge of the cup. Go ahead and use your paper towel, pulling it back towards yourself as you roll it. And as you do this action, you should begin to see that the brush will come back into its finer point. You could even use your fingertips to smooth it, okay? All right, so to paint. All right, I'm gonna use a nice dark green, something that you'll be able to see, I think. And I'm gonna start in here. And you can see I don't have a lot of water in my brush. So even though I'm painting upright, my paints aren't dribbling down. If I have too much water, let me show you what happens if we have far too much water in that brush. Okay, so I've tried to load my brush up. I hope this works. All right, and can you see the water pool? And if I had far too much water, you see how it dribbles? Now that might be an effect that you want to experiment with, and you're more than welcome to do that. You certainly can. That's just fine. You see how it sort of finds that path of the original drip? Let's get some more drips going. Okay. A fun thing you can do, I remember doing this when I was in, oh, who knows, I was young. But I remember getting a big old puddle of water and with watercolor on a page, and you'd get a straw and you could blow through the straw onto that puddle and it would disperse almost like spider webs. So that might be something fun that you can play with as well. Okay. I can also utilize the same techniques with a paintbrush that I did with my marker and my pastel over here. Stippling, you can see I'm stippling. If I use just the edge of the brush, the tip of the brush, I get very small dots. I can use the side of the brush to create larger. Of course, I can vary the brushes and in size and get completely different effects as well. Okay. Okay, a good rule to remember with watercolors, the more water you have in your brush, the more diluted your colors will be. They will appear lighter. If you want to create more concentrated or darker colors, remember that technique I talked about with drawing out the water. You just want your brush to be slightly damp, not soaking wet, and you pick up and twirl your brush in that watercolor several times to pick up as much of the pigment as you possibly can before working on the paper. And I don't know if you can tell, but this area right here is far darker than this area up here, right? That's because I had much more water up here, much less water, and far more of the watercolor pigment on the brush. All right. couple of other techniques that you can utilize. You could use a wet and wet technique, wet paper, wet watercolor on wet paper. So I could just put my clean water on here first, followed by my pigment, and I can just let things occur naturally. Now you'll notice that a lot of my paint is running downward. It's simply the position of the paper on the drawing board standing upright. If you work flat, you're going to get very different effect, okay? You could also take a little spray bottle and spritz it and experiment and see what happens. If you happen to have kosher salt or sea salt, the like slightly larger crystals, you could paint in a wet and wet type of technique. You could then put your salt crystals on top and lay it flat, of course, and let it dry. And you'll notice that the salt crystals actually start to absorb the paint. And when it's all dry, you gently brush off the salt crystals and you get this very distinct stippled type of texture. And it could be really lovely. So I hope that you'll try some of these techniques. Be creative in the items you select to use for creating color. If you have the opportunity to do it, have some fun with it. Okay. I hope this tutorial will be helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below the video, and I'll look forward to talking with you soon. Bye, everyone. Have a great day.